June, you mentioned one quilt was stuffed with wool. Were most of them stuffed with cotton, and where did they get that cotton batting back then?
The quilts, yeah, the quilts would have wool bat, and you would card it so that it was laying flat. Like every time you washed it,
Yeah.
you'd have to remove the wool, and then, no, just a minute, sorry, I'm thinking of a comforter. You had to do that for a comforter. No, the woolen bat was one, there was the cotton, and the cotton would be imported. And you could purchase the cotton at like a general store.
So they bought cotton.
They would buy cotton to act as the
And was it
filler.
already in batted?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so they just
Yeah,
bought
they
it.
didn't have to do that with it to flush it out. But the thing about having cotton as a filler, you had to have your lines of quilting very close together,
So it didn't plump.
so they didn't all clump up.
Was the woolen stuffing very common?
Yes, we've seen woolen stuff. What you really like is you don't like to tear seams apart, but often with old quilts, you can there's holes in them. And so you just look in that hole and you get an idea what kind of filling there is. And you can see whether it's wool or cotton, or sometimes there's no filling, or sometimes there's maybe an old blanket. And that acted as a filler. Because as you know, a quilt is a fabric sandwich. You have the top, the filling, and then the back. And the bats that you buy nowadays for quilts, you have a lot of choice. But you don't really need to put your stitches so close together because the bat sort of hangs together.
Another question I had. I thought the oldest original quilts were made of scraps of old clothing, which had no other good purpose, but you could sew them all together and make something warm for your bed out of them.
Yeah.
And because they were just scraps, they actually looked more like your picture, the crazy quilts. Some of the oldest quilts I've seen were like that. They were just all different colors and shapes and sizes, various different fabrics, and just junk old stuff, and they sewed it together and made a new use out of it by making it into a quilt. And I thought the fancy pattern quilts came along much later than that, when people actually had money to go out and buy fabrics in the specific colors they wanted to make a pattern, because these old ones I've seen going back to like 1830 were just bits and pieces.
They were.
Or did it depend how much money you had?
Well, certainly people weren't going out and buying fabric, cutting it up, and making a quilt. They wouldn't do that. In fact, until they had fabrics that were worn out and had no further use, that's when they started making quilts, because they could, like the one I was showing you that had the little homespun squares in it. That would be a typical way of using very old fabrics to make a quilt with these very small pieces that they could find. And women like to make things that were nice most of the time, even if they were in a hurry and they had a lot of other things to do and they needed bed coverings. They would still, there was a certain artistic sense.
So it was more whether you wanted to be bothered making a pattern, or whether you were creative enough to do that, or...
Oh, well, I think the crazy quilt was, you weren't buying those fabrics. They were still scraps, but the types of material were different. You were getting velvets and silks, and you were getting the fancy
But that's what
stitches.
scrap clothing is. It's all different fabrics and colors and
Yeah,
like your old clothes all
yeah. But I think
put together into something purposeful.
they I don't know that I've ever seen any quilts that were just made like the Crazy Quilt at an earlier time. They seem to, any quilts I've seen have had some arrangement of squares.
Oh, the oldest ones I've seen were just a mishmash of bits and pieces of anything and
So they
everything that
weren't,
they
they
had.
didn't have a, they
No.
they weren't a square.
Different sizes, shapes. And this isn't a friend of mine who lives down near Kitchener in a place called Ayr. And they emigrated from Scotland 5 generations now. And they're still in the original farmhouse and they still use the old quilts and the old furniture. And yeah, they've got all kinds of these old quilts that were made way, way, way back, and they're just all different shapes and sizes and colors and fabrics and just sewn together.
So,
To
so
make
the
a-
finished product wouldn't even be straight. You'd get edges that were higgledy-piggledy.
No, they made them into a square edge, but the whole inside of it
Was all over the place.
yeah, yeah.
If you had a quilt,
But they actually look quite beautiful.
if you had a quilt, you probably didn't wash it very much, you aired it, right?
And that was something
Yeah,
else I was
working,
gonna say. How did you wash a quilt back then?
Well,
Because
if
they're
it's filled
heavy
with
when
wool,
they're
it would
wet.
be heavy,
And
it
all
would
you've
shift.
got, so
But
wash
you put it
them.
out in the spring and air it.
I don't think
Let
they
the
wash
sun
things that much. No,
sterilize
you
it.
couldn't.
And beat it back
You couldn't.
to get the dust out.
Yeah.
How about a feather company? How long have they been using that?
Well, in Waterloo County, the German people had a feather bed, like it was sort of like a duvet.
Yeah.
And that textile there, that blue checkered one, when you look at it, there's an opening where you would put feathers that were contained within like a pillow, big pillow. And that was what they had for a long time. It would be very warm.
I know when I was a youngster, when we lived on the farm, and we had feather comforters.
And that was Quebec. Nice. Well, they'd have a whole other tradition too there, with their textiles.
I was just gonna say, your collection is really vast, and from the early years to more of the modern time. What is the earliest quilt here?
The earliest quilt.
Is it the one on the chair that you pointed out? On the evening?
I'm not 100% certain of the age of these quilts.
Right.
They were all in really good condition. Sometimes the patterns have been carried on for a long time. Some of them could have been made in the 40s or 50s, but because they've been well looked after, they just, and their tradition of the design and the border has continued. So unless they can tell you exactly when they made it, you don't really know.
You brought that to life with the slides, those wasn't it?
Anybody else?
Well, the topic was brought up of maintenance, so what do you recommend for both quilts and companies like that that are woven in terms of getting them clean or keeping them clean or storing them over the summer when the moths are out?
Well, certainly it's a good idea to air them, and that's what we've done. Occasionally we'll get something that's really dirty, like it feels dirty, it smells kind of dirty. So we fill a bathtub with lukewarm water and we put a mild detergent, I shouldn't say detergent, we shouldn't really use detergents, but a mild soap in there, and just let it sit for a while. And then, this is a 2-person job. I don't have the strength, and you're not supposed to wring, that's very bad. You squeeze, you don't wring. So David and I will squeeze as much water as we can, and then we rinse it 3 or 4 times until the water looks better. And then we take it outside and we lay it on the lawn, because it actually sits on top of the grass, and then the air circulates underneath. And it's better to put it kind of in the shade on a warm day rather than in the sun, because it will fade. So that's what we've done with the woolen blankets, the coverlets, some of the quilts. Now, you have to be really careful with the quilts and what you can do with, like reds in particular are really bad for running. So if you take a cotton cloth, a damp cotton cloth, and you sort of press on some of the areas and see if any dye comes off. But if you're in any doubt, you feel a little bit queasy about this, there are places that specialize in washing or cleaning textiles. We really haven't done that. We've sort of either just let them be or done something ourselves, Karen, and we've been lucky so far.
And a blanket box would be the best way to store them.
Yeah, the blanket box is good. If I've got one blanket box I like particularly, because Bruce made it, and it's lined with cedar. And when you open it up, it smells so good. And of course, that's an idea. Yes, Gary.
I was wondering if you could go back to the Titanic scheme. I think that's about 5 or 8 times with John Woolen. I don't know if anybody knows. There's a couple items on there that's historically accurate.
The ice
Yeah.
cream,
No.
the White Star,
Yeah, that's one. And the other one is?
was it a 2-stacker?
No, it's 4 stack.
Remember that?
It's
Well, the last stack is.
Somebody had to
it's
say it.
there to balance out, it's 4. So the last one doesn't work. White Star line. So that's what the stars are.
Yeah.
So is it
You don't think
accurate?
The iceberg is accurate?
I never said
Oh, okay.
Is it accurate?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, people put things into quilts and then somebody said, well, what's that? Well, the White Star is the shipping line.
Okay.
Shipping line.
And then everybody in Liverpool knows that the last stack was a fake. Even though the ship is built in Belfast, right? But its port of registration was Liverpool. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention it.
Yeah.
Okay, I gotta go make some tea.
Sounds good. So I don't know what these pictures look like from where you are sitting.
Very good.
They're all right?
Yeah.
Well, that's
How
good
many
news.
blankets do you own?
Well, all together, I haven't counted lately, but I think all together, probably quilts, blankets, and covers, probably not quite 80. Now, it sounds like a lot.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot.
But in the group.
Slightly.
And then these have newspapers.
And of course, I'm hoping to find a good home for these quilts. I'd love to have them all go as a whole collection, because I've really looked after them. Like every year, I do something different with those quilts. I will fix something. Like if there's something needs mending, I'll maybe mend it. I'll just do one a year. And they get aired, occasionally they get washed. And I see them on the line and I just go,
Should fold them, either, should you? You're not supposed to fold them.
no, that's right, you should roll them.
Roll them,
As you
yeah.
saw that humble
Yeah.
blanket on a roll, that's absolutely right. So I'm not a museum. But I'm aware of these things. So you're not supposed to fold them the same way.
Same way.
Fold them differently.
Yeah.
And make sure, if you do store them in a blanket box, you really should make sure that you varnish the wood, or you do something so that the fabric isn't touching the wood, because the wood is acidic. And it could do damage to your fabrics.